The next injury I want to talk about is a brain injury. And in order to understand a brain injury, we show the jury how it happens. What happens within the brain that makes it damaged. So the first illustration you're going to see is how the brain moves or rattles within the skull. The brain is connected to the brain stem within the skull, and there is space between the brain and the skull. The brain actually floats within the skull in a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, and that protects the brain from hitting or rattling up against the skull. Well, when there is trauma or when there is force applied to the head, as you see at the top, the sudden force causes the front of the brain to impact inside of the skull. And so there's a striking of the brain on the skull. As the head whips back, as you see on the bottom illustration, the recoil action causes the brain to impact the opposite side of the skull. And the impact from those forces causes damage to the cortex of the brain. The cortex is labeled in this illustration, and it's the part of the brain that you see is responsible for higher level functioning. The next illustration shows rotational force within the brain. This results from the brain actually twisting upon itself and twisting within the skull when there is side-to-side force applied. That causes a very specific injury within the brain. The next illustration shows what happens within the brain. This is an illustration of a neuron and an axon. The neuron are the yellow circular structures at the bottom and top of the illustration with what looks like tree branches coming out. And the neurons are the individual cells of the brain. The neurons communicate with one another in order to make the body function and to send signals throughout the body. Well, the way that they do that is they communicate with other neurons through the axon. The axon is that long cord-like structure between the two neurons. The axon is a little bit like an extension cord. It is a cable and is covered by an outer covering that protects the cables that send signals back and forth between the neurons. The next illustration shows what happens when there's a rotational force applied. As the red arrow shows, that axon is twisted and torn from that force. And so the neurons tear away from the synapses. The synapses are those tree-like structures where the axon connects to the neuron. It's kind of like unplugging the extension cord and damaging the outer covering. The next illustration shows what happens when that axon is torn and broken apart. The individual neurons become necrotic. That means they die. They die because of lack of water flow, blood flow, and oxygen flow. And so when that neuron dies, it cannot communicate with other neurons. And because the rotational force causes such damage, the damage to the individual cells in the brain can happen in multiple parts of the brain. So when neurons die and when they're damaged in different parts of the brain, it makes it difficult for the brain to communicate with itself and cause the body to function. That's an explanation of how a brain injury happens. Oftentimes people come in and they will complain of sensitivity to light, sensitivity to sound, dizziness, nausea, in extreme cases, anger outbursts, inability to control their emotions. We have people come in and tell us that they started driving to our office and had to stop and call because they forgot directions. Many times people will forget very, very simple tasks like to turn the stove off after they're cooking. And so it's important for the jury to understand how a brain injury happens and what the effects can be so that the jury will give the compensation to protect people and to get the medical care they need for their brain injuries. There's also a very important concept called neuroplasticity. And that's a fancy word that just means the brain is a muscle and can be rehabbed like any other muscle in the body. You can have brain therapy and treatment to make the brain rewire itself around the damaged cells, around the damaged neurons, so that the brain can start communicating normally and have normal function. And so we work with highly advanced medical centers throughout the country. We work with one in Arkansas, one in Dallas, one in Houston, one in New Orleans, so that after a brain injury, our clients can go get that treatment to rehabilitate their brain, rework that muscle so that it can start communicating like it's supposed to.